The night sky above the Velari Palace was a blanket of stars, endless and sparkling. On most nights, it was a sight that filled Princess Lyra with peace. But tonight was different. Tonight, something was wrong. Lyra paced through the palace corridors, her heart heavy. The grand halls of the royal palace echoed with the sound of her footsteps, but they seemed distant, as though they belonged to someone else. She had been born into this life, crowned from the moment she took her first breath. As the only heir to the throne of the Velari, a powerful alien race, she had always known her future would be one of duty and sacrifice. But now, everything she thought she knew was falling apart. The Council of Elders, the ruling body of the Velari, had been whispering. Lyra had overheard their conversations, their plans. They spoke of her, of how she would change things. They feared that her vision for a peaceful galaxy, one where the Velari did not dominate other species, would weaken their power. They feared she would unite the various alien factions against them, and that terrified them. The Velari had long maintained their rule by strength, by war, and by fear. They believed they were the superior race in the galaxy, and they kept their dominance by crushing anyone who dared to challenge them. But Lyra was different. She had always believed that peace could be achieved through diplomacy, understanding, and cooperation. She saw potential in others, humans, the Kalin, the Ferex, species they had long considered beneath them. But that belief made her a threat. Tonight, she learned something she hadn't expected. The elders had decided to have her killed. They had called it a necessary sacrifice. To them, she was a problem to be dealt with, an obstacle to their unchallenged rule. She stopped in front of a large window, looking out over the vast city below. The lights of the Velari capital twinkled in the distance, but to her, they seemed distant and cold. The city she had once loved now felt like a prison. She had always thought she would be the one to bring change, to heal the wounds of her people and the galaxy. But now, it seemed the only future left for her was death. Her heart raced as she turned away from the window. She needed to leave. There was no time to waste. If she stayed, she would be captured. And if they caught her, they would kill her. She couldn't let that happen. She wasn't ready to die. Not yet. But how could she escape? The palace was heavily guarded. Even if she managed to slip past the guards, the city itself was full of Velari loyalists who would be looking for her. Her only chance was to leave the planet. And quickly. She grabbed her cloak, fastening it tightly around her shoulders. It would provide some cover, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to hide her identity for long. Her features were unmistakable, even in disguise. The unique silver glow to her skin, the royal markings on her neck, and the soft, luminescent hair, these were the signs of the royal family. She had been born to rule. But now, all of that made her a target. As she hurried through the corridors, she tried to push away the fear that gnawed at her insides. She had faced danger before, of course. But this felt different. This was her own people, those she had trusted, those who had raised her. How could they do this to her? The answer was simple: power. At the end of the hall, she reached the hidden door that led to the royal gardens. No one was supposed to know about this passage. Only a few of the trusted servants had ever used it. She slid the door open and stepped into the cool night air. The scent of blooming flowers filled her senses, but there was no time to enjoy it. She had to move fast. The garden led to a small ship dock hidden beneath the palace grounds. It was her last hope, a ship capable of leaving the planet unnoticed. But even as she hurried towards it, she could feel the eyes of the palace on her. It was only a matter of time before the Velari authorities noticed she was missing. As she reached the ship, her breath caught in her throat. It was there, her escape, her only chance. But as she stepped closer, a shadow moved in the distance. "You're not going anywhere, Princess." Lyra froze, her hand hovering over the ship's hatch. The voice was familiar, and it sent a chill down her spine. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. There, stepping from the shadows, was Jarek, her oldest friend. Or at least, he had once been. The shock of seeing him now, standing between her and freedom, left her breathless. "Jarek?" "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can't be part of this." He shook his head, his expression unreadable. His once warm, gentle eyes were now cold and distant. He was one of the Council's enforcers, someone tasked with carrying out their orders. "I don't have a choice, Lyra. You know that. They'll kill me if I don't do this." His voice was firm, but there was a hint of regret in his eyes. "Please, come back. They're not going to hurt you if you return. They just want you to understand. You don't have to die." "I can't," she replied, her voice trembling. "I can't go back to that. I can't live in a cage again." Jarek took a step forward. "You don't understand. The Velari are stronger than you think. They'll hunt you down, and you'll never be safe. Just come back with me. They'll protect you." She shook her head violently. "No, they want to kill me, Jarek. You know that. The Council doesn't care about me. I can't let them destroy everything I fought for." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jarek's gaze softened, and for the first time, Lyra saw the conflict in his eyes. He didn't want to do this, but the fear of the Council's wrath was enough to make anyone do terrible things. He had chosen his loyalty, but Lyra refused to choose the same path. "I will never let them use me as their pawn," she whispered, her voice steady now, filled with the strength that had been growing inside her for years. Jarek's expression faltered for a brief second before he hardened again. "I can't let you go, Lyra." With a swift motion, he raised his weapon. But before he could act, Lyra made her move. She reached for the energy blade hidden beneath her cloak, activating it in a flash. The blade hummed to life, its blue glow lighting up the dark garden. "I don't want to fight you, Jarek," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "But I will if I have to." Jarek hesitated, his weapon still raised. "Don't make me do this, Lyra." For a heartbeat, the two stood facing each other, neither willing to strike. But time was running out. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the distance. The guards were coming. Lyra didn't wait any longer. She lunged forward, moving faster than Jarek could react. In a flash, she was past him, her blade narrowly missing him as she dove into the ship's hatch. The engine roared to life, and with one last glance over her shoulder, she saw Jarek standing there, watching her leave. His expression was unreadable. She could only hope he would find a way to forgive her one day. The ship soared into the sky, leaving the palace and the life she had known behind. But even as she ascended into the stars, Lyra knew this was only the beginning. The Velari would stop at nothing to hunt her down, and she would fight for her freedom, no matter the cost. Eli Carter hadn't meant to get involved in anything unusual that day. He was just another guy trying to make a living on Earth, doing odd jobs and minding his own business. But that all changed when he found himself caught in the middle of something far bigger than anything he'd ever experienced. It started like any other day for Eli. He was working on a routine repair job on the outskirts of a small town, far from the busy city. His hands were greasy, his shirt torn, and the sun was high in the sky, beating down on his back. Eli didn't mind, though. He was used to the heat, the quiet, and the solitude. He liked it that way. That afternoon, as Eli finished fixing a broken water pump, he heard something strange, a hum, soft at first, then growing louder. It was a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He looked around, trying to find the source. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the endless stretch of dusty farmland. But the hum was growing, and now he could feel it vibrating through the air, like something massive was approaching. His instincts kicked in. Eli wasn't new to trouble. He had seen his fair share of things, some strange, some terrifying, but nothing like this. He quickly wiped his hands on a rag, grabbed his gear, and moved toward the noise. His eyes scanned the horizon, but there was no sign of anything that could explain the sound. Then, as if out of nowhere, the sky lit up. A streak of bright light shot across the sky like a comet, leaving a trail of smoke in its wake. Eli barely had time to react before it crashed into the ground a few hundred meters away, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. His heart raced. He knew he had to go investigate, but his mind was already screaming at him to turn and run. Something didn't feel right. Still, his curiosity won out. Eli had never been the type to back down from an unknown. With his instincts guiding him, he grabbed his flashlight and bolted toward the impact site. As he neared the crash site, the scent of burnt earth filled his nose. The impact crater was wide, and in the center of it was a ship. It wasn't a human-made vessel. No, this was something far beyond anything Eli had ever seen. Sleek, metallic, and alien. The edges of the ship shimmered, reflecting the light in strange patterns. It was nothing like the junky spaceships or satellites that occasionally pass by Earth. This was something different. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He had always suspected there was more out there in the universe, but to see it with his own eyes was something else entirely. His mind raced, and for a moment, he forgot everything around him. The only thing that mattered was the ship and what it represented, proof that humans were not alone. But then, as if on cue, the silence was broken. From the wreckage, a figure emerged. At first, Eli couldn't make out who or what it was. The dust was thick, and the figure was moving slowly. But as it stepped forward, the shape became clearer. A woman, but she wasn't entirely human. She had glowing silver skin, like moonlight reflected on water. Her hair shimmered like it was made of starlight, flowing in waves down her back. Her eyes, large and luminescent, glowed with an otherworldly light. The woman wore strange clothing, different from anything Eli had ever seen before. It was elegant, intricate, and unlike any fabric known to mankind. She looked like a queen, a princess, someone who belonged in a story. The woman, no, the alien, took a shaky step forward. Her legs wobbled, as if she was unsteady from the crash. She glanced around, confused and scared, and then her eyes locked onto Eli's. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Eli's heart raced. He had read about aliens, heard stories from conspiracy theorists, but never in his wildest dreams had he imagined meeting one in person, especially not like this. Finally, Eli spoke, his voice cracking. "Oh, hey. Are you okay?" The alien woman's eyes narrowed, and she took a step back, as if assessing him. "You are human?" she asked in a voice that sounded like music, though it was laced with uncertainty. Eli blinked. The voice was beautiful, like something he'd never heard before. "Yeah, I'm human," he replied, trying to keep his cool. "And you're an alien, right?" She nodded slowly, still eyeing him with caution. "I am. Lyra. I come from a place far from here. My ship, it crashed." Eli could hardly believe what he was hearing. This woman, this alien, was speaking to him in perfect English. But then again, maybe it wasn't so surprising. He'd seen enough weird stuff in his life to know that not everything could be explained in simple terms. "Lyra, huh?" Eli said, trying to keep the conversation going. "Well, you're a long way from home, that's for sure. What happened? How did you end up here?" Lyra looked down at her feet, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and fear. "My people, they are after me. They wish to see me dead." Her voice faltered as she spoke. Eli's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just some random alien encounter. This was real danger. Lyra was in trouble, and if her people were after her, that meant she had enemies who were powerful and ruthless. "You're in trouble?" Eli asked, his voice softer now. "What do you mean, your people are after you?" Lyra seemed to hesitate, unsure of whether to trust Eli. After a long pause, she spoke again. "I am the princess of my people, but they do not want me to rule. They fear what I represent. A change in the way things are done. I have been betrayed." Eli's mind was racing. A princess. betrayed by her own people. This was like something out of a movie. But there was something in Lyra's eyes that told him she wasn't lying. She was scared. And more importantly, she needed help. "Well," Eli said, taking a step forward, "you've come to the right person. I guess. I don't know much about alien politics, but I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. You've got a long way to go to get home, but I'll help you however I can." Lyra seemed taken aback. "You would help me? You do not even know me." Eli shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Doesn't matter. You're in trouble, and I'm not the kind of guy to stand by and do nothing." For a moment, Lyra studied him. It was clear that she was used to dealing with powerful, dangerous beings, not regular humans like Eli, but something in his eyes, something in the way he spoke, made her trust him, at least for the moment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft, but filled with gratitude. "You are kind, and I do not know what to do without your help." Eli smiled. "No problem. First things first, though. Let's get you out of here before someone else shows up." As they made their way away from the crash site, Eli couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. This was no ordinary day. This was the beginning of something much bigger than him. He didn't know it yet, but the fate of not just Lyra, but the entire galaxy, was now in his hands. Eli had no idea what he was getting himself into when he agreed to help Lyra. He figured he'd take her to a safe place, hide her for a while, and then figure things out. But nothing ever went according to plan. As they sped down the highway in Eli's old truck, the weight of what they were doing sank in. Lyra sat next to him, her silver skin glowing softly in the dim light. The truck's engine hummed in the background, but the silence between them felt heavy. Eli glanced at her, trying to figure out what was going through her mind. "You okay?" he asked, trying to break the silence. Lyra's eyes flickered to him. She looked out the window, watching the landscape rush by. "I do not know," she said softly, her voice distant. "Everything is unfamiliar to me here. Earth, it is unlike my home." Eli chuckled. "Yeah, Earth isn't exactly a paradise, but it's home. At least for now, it's where we can lay low." The plan was simple enough. Eli would take Lyra to a remote cabin he owned on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it would keep them off the radar for a while. At least, that's what Eli hoped. But as they got closer to the cabin, Eli began to feel uneasy. The night had grown eerily quiet. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, or someone, following them. "You feel that?" Eli asked, his voice tense. Lyra's sharp eyes were already scanning the surroundings. "Yes, I feel it too. We are not alone." Before Eli could respond, the sound of an engine roared in the distance. It wasn't just one engine. It was several. Eli's heart raced as he pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck surged forward, but the engines behind them were getting closer faster. "What the hell?" Eli muttered, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Lyra's expression hardened. "They have found us." "Who?" "My people," she said, her voice full of anger and fear. "The Velari. They have sent a group to track me down." Eli's mind was racing. He'd only known about the Velari for a short time, but already he knew they were dangerous. He could hear the roar of the approaching vehicles getting louder. He had no idea how many were chasing them, but he wasn't going to stop and find out. "Hold on," Eli shouted, swerving the truck down a narrow dirt road that led into the dense forest. Trees whizzed past them, branches scraping the side of the vehicle. Behind them, the Velari pursuit vehicles followed in hot pursuit. Eli's hands gripped the wheel tighter. He was used to being in tight situations. He'd been in enough firefights in his past to know how to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This was beyond anything he'd ever experienced. He glanced at Lyra, her face set in determination, as she braced herself against the seat. "Eli, there's a clearing up ahead," she said, her voice steady. "We need to lose them there." He nodded, keeping his focus on the road. "I've got it. Just hold on tight." They'd reached the clearing, a wide open space surrounded by thick trees. Eli slammed the brakes, spinning the truck around in a tight turn that sent the tires screeching. He floored the accelerator again, heading back toward the forest at full speed. The Velari vehicles behind them followed suit, not giving up an inch. They were faster, better equipped, and clearly more experienced at this sort of thing. But Eli had something they didn't: desperation. He swerved the truck again, narrowly avoiding a thick tree trunk as he guided it down a steep incline. The Velari vehicles tried to follow, but the uneven terrain made it harder for them to keep up. Lyra's voice rang out, full of urgency. "Eli, they're closing in. I need to do something." Eli didn't have time to ask what she meant. Before he could respond, Lyra raised her hand, and suddenly, a bright light filled the truck's cabin. It was blinding, like the sun had exploded inside the vehicle. The Velari vehicles slammed on their brakes, trying to avoid the blinding light, but it was too late. One of them skidded off the road, crashing into a tree with a loud crunch. The others hesitated, slowing down to avoid the same fate. Eli barely had time to process what had just happened. The light had come from Lyra's hand, and it was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was pure energy, a force that had stopped their pursuers in their tracks. But Lyra's face was pale. "I can't hold them off for long," she said, her voice strained. "We need to keep moving." Eli nodded, not wasting any time. He floored the gas pedal again, the truck roaring as they pushed forward. But even with the Velari slowed down, he knew it wouldn't be long before they caught up. They needed to get somewhere safe, and fast. They spent the next few hours weaving through the woods, taking back roads and cutting across fields, doing everything they could to lose their pursuers. Eli was driving on pure instinct now, his mind working a mile a minute as he plotted their next move. Eventually, they found themselves in a small town, a place Eli knew well, but one that was quiet enough to go unnoticed for a while. He knew a man here, a former soldier, who could help them get supplies and lay low for a few days. But as they pulled into the town, Eli's sense of unease grew stronger. Something wasn't right. The streets were empty, too empty. The silence was deafening. Lyra, ever observant, noticed it too. "Something is wrong," she whispered. "It's too quiet." Eli's eyes darted around. That's when he saw it, a black vehicle parked a few blocks down the street. It wasn't one of theirs. At least, not one of the Velari. But the way it sat there, so still, so out of place, sent a chill down his spine. "Get down," Eli ordered, slamming his foot on the brakes. He threw the truck into reverse, but before he could back out of the street, a figure stepped out of the vehicle. A tall, armored figure with a helmet that covered most of its face. It wasn't human. The figure raised a hand, signaling for something, or someone, to follow. From the shadows, more figures emerged, dozens of them, all moving toward Eli and Lyra. "Get out of here," Eli shouted, his voice filled with panic. But Lyra was already on her feet, her eyes blazing with a newfound determination. "I won't run anymore," she said, her voice cold. "I'll face them." Before Eli could stop her, Lyra stepped out of the truck and faced the advancing figures. She raised her hand again, and this time, the air around her shimmered with power. The energy surrounding her crackled like a storm about to break. Eli hesitated for a moment, but his instincts told him to trust her. With a deep breath, he grabbed his rifle from the back seat, ready for whatever came next. They weren't going to run anymore. The first of the armored figures lunged toward Lyra, but she was faster. With a swift movement of her hand, the air around her turned to energy, knocking the attacker backward. But there were more, dozens more, all closing in on them. Eli could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but as Lyra fought, her powers radiating with incredible force, He realized that there was more to her than he had ever imagined. Together, they could stand their ground, and somehow, against all odds, they would survive. Eli's heart pounded as he crouched behind the truck, watching the armored figures advance. He had never seen anything like it. These beings were clearly not human, their black armor gleaming under the moonlight. The air felt thick, charged with the crackle of anticipation. The Velari had caught up to them again, but this time, Eli had no plan. There were too many of them, and no amount of running would help. He looked over at Lyra, who was standing in the open, her silver skin shimmering in the dim light. Her eyes were focused, her stance strong, like she had made a decision. She wasn't afraid, and that gave Eli a strange sense of hope. But it wasn't enough to shake the fear gnawing at him. Lyra's powers were incredible, but was it really enough to face so many enemies? "Lyra," he called out, his voice tight with urgency. "You need to get back in the truck. We need to move now." But Lyra didn't budge. She simply stood there, her eyes locked on the approaching figures. There was something different about her now, a strength that wasn't there before. Something was awakening within her. She seemed to grow taller, more imposing, her presence more commanding. "I won't run anymore, Eli," she said, her voice calm, but full of conviction. "They've hunted me for too long. They think they can break me, but they are wrong. I will fight." Eli stared at her, a mixture of awe and worry on his face. He had seen her display her powers before, but this was different. This wasn't just a desperate defense. Lyra was ready to take on her enemies head-on. And somehow, Eli knew she wasn't just doing it for herself. She was doing it for everyone, including him. The first of the Velari soldiers raised his weapon, aiming it straight at Lyra. Eli's hand instinctively went to his rifle, but before he could react, Lyra moved. She was fast, faster than anything Eli had ever seen. Her silver skin glowed with an otherworldly light as she leaped into the air, her body twisting and spinning with fluid grace. The Velari soldier never stood a chance. Lyra's hand shot out, and with a surge of energy, a bright pulse of light burst from her palm. The soldier was thrown backward, crashing into a nearby tree with a sickening thud. Eli blinked in disbelief. Had she just destroyed him with a single move? But there was no time to process what had just happened. The rest of the Velari soldiers were closing in, and Lyra wasn't backing down. Her eyes locked onto the next target, an imposing figure in heavy armor. And before Eli could even think, Lyra was already moving again. She slammed into the soldier with such force that the ground beneath them trembled. Her silver skin pulsed with energy, and her hands glowed with blinding light. The Velari soldier tried to raise his weapon, but Lyra was too quick. She grabbed him by the arm, twisting it with unnatural strength before sending another burst of energy through him. The soldier collapsed, his armor sparking as the power drained from him. Eli's mouth went dry. This was not the same woman who had landed in his life only a few days ago. She was no longer just a princess on the run. She was something far more powerful, a force that could rival the Velari themselves. But how was this possible? How had she unlocked this strength? "Eli," Lyra called, snapping him out of his daze. She was surrounded by the remaining Velari soldiers, but there was no fear in her eyes. She was in control. Eli hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. The rifle in his hands felt useless compared to the power Lyra was wielding. But he couldn't just stand there. He had to help her. He took a deep breath, remembering the combat training he had received back in the day, and sprinted toward a group of soldiers who were trying to flank them. He fired a few shots, taking out one of them. The others scattered, momentarily distracted, giving Lyra a chance to regroup. She turned to him, her silver eyes glowing brightly. "Stay back, Eli," she said, her voice firm but reassuring. "I can handle this." Eli wasn't sure if he believed her. The Velari were relentless, and no matter how strong Lyra was, she couldn't take them all down alone. He wasn't about to leave her in the middle of a fight like this, no matter how powerful she had become. But as if reading his thoughts, Lyra stepped forward. "Trust me," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I've always been strong, Eli. I just didn't know it yet. But now I do." She raised both hands, her fingers glowing with an intense light. The energy around her intensified, swirling like a storm, as if the very air around her was alive. Her power was growing, expanding, and Eli watched in awe as she directed the energy outward. The ground shook as Lyra unleashed a pulse of energy, so strong that it sent the remaining Velari soldiers flying back. The shockwave rippled through the forest, knocking trees over and sending rocks tumbling. Eli shielded his eyes from the blinding light, but even with his back to it, he could feel the raw power coursing through the air. When the light faded and the dust settled, Eli cautiously looked up. The Velari soldiers were all on the ground, either unconscious or too injured to continue fighting. Some of them were still twitching, their bodies fried by the energy Lyra had unleashed. Lyra stood at the center of the battlefield, breathing heavily, her face exhausted but triumphant. Her silver skin was still glowing, but there was an almost serene calmness to her now. The fight was over, and they had won. Eli couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. He had seen powerful soldiers, advanced technology, and weapons that could destroy entire cities, but none of that had come close to the force that Lyra had just demonstrated. She wasn't just a princess on the run anymore. She was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. "Lyra." Eli's voice was full of awe. "That was incredible." Lyra smiled faintly, though it was clear she was exhausted. "It was nothing. I've been running from my enemies for so long, trying to hide who I truly am. But now I realize that I don't need to run anymore. I can't hide from my destiny." Eli took a step closer, studying her face. "But how? I mean, how did you do all that? How did you unlock that power?" Lyra looked down at her hands, the glowing light around her slowly fading. "I never understood what I was capable of, Eli. I've always been told that my powers were meant to be controlled, that I was supposed to follow the rules of my people. But now, I understand that my strength isn't just about control. It's about freedom. Freedom to choose my own path, to fight for what's right." Eli watched her carefully, taking in her words. The realization was sinking in. Lyra wasn't just any alien princess. She was a force in her own right, someone who could change the fate of entire civilizations. But even more than that, she was someone who had chosen to stand up for herself, for the people she cared about, and for a future that was hers to shape. "Your people don't know what they've got coming," Eli said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I think they just made a huge mistake." Lyra's smile returned, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "Perhaps, but they don't understand yet. They will." She turned to look at the fallen Velari soldiers, then back at Eli. "This fight is far from over. The Velari will come again, and they won't stop until they have me. But now, I'm not alone. You've shown me that I don't have to do this on my own." Eli nodded, determination hardening in his chest. "You don't. I'm with you, Lyra. We'll take them down together." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Together, then. And for the first time since they met, Eli felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, fighting by her side, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. After the battle in the woods, the weight of what they had just done sank in. Eli and Lyra had barely escaped the relentless Velari pursuit, and although they had emerged victorious, the fight was far from over. Lyra was strong, no doubt about it. But Eli knew they couldn't continue on this path forever, just running and fighting. They needed more than just brute strength to survive. They needed allies, but making alliances in a world as dangerous as theirs was never simple. Eli and Lyra had no time to celebrate their victory. The night had barely begun when they made their decision to leave the small town they had taken refuge in. It was clear that the Velari would not give up, and they would soon be back. But where could they go? And more importantly, Who could they trust? We need to find a place where the Valori won't be able to track us easily, Eli said, his voice low as they sped down a deserted road in his truck. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of their decisions. Lyra nodded, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. I know, but we can't keep running forever, Eli. We need allies. We need someone powerful enough to fight the Valori on our terms. Eli glanced over at her, taking in her words. She was right. They couldn't keep hiding from the Valori. Lyra was no longer the helpless princess she once was, but even she would need help to stand against the full might of the Valori Empire. But who could they trust? I know a guy, Eli said slowly, thinking back to his past. A friend from my old life. He's not someone I'd normally go to for help, but he's got connections. He knows things. He might be able to get us some kind of protection. But the problem is, he's not exactly the most trustworthy guy. Lyra raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Eli hesitated. He's a mercenary. He works for whoever pays him. Not exactly the kind of person you'd call a friend, but he's been useful in the past. His name's Jack, and he operates out of a place called the Hideout. It's, well, a safe house of sorts, but it's a pretty dangerous place. A lot of criminals, a lot of people trying to stay off the radar. Lyra considered this for a moment, then nodded. I understand. We have no choice. If we want to survive, we need to make this alliance, no matter how risky it might be. Eli took a deep breath, his mind racing. He wasn't sure if Jack was the right person to help them, but they didn't have many options left. As they drove through the darkened streets, Eli thought about the kind of man Jack was. He had a reputation for being tough, ruthless even, but Eli knew he had a certain honor. He had a code, even if it wasn't the kind most people would admire. And that code might be exactly what they needed right now. As they reached the outskirts of a rundown part of the city, Eli's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The hideout wasn't far now, but he knew it would be risky to go there. There were too many unknowns, too many dangers, but they had no other choice. We're close, Eli muttered. Stay alert. Lyra nodded, her hand resting on the door handle, ready for whatever might come next. The truck slowed as they entered a dark alley, the faint glow of neon signs flickering in the distance. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Eli parked the truck behind an old building, making sure it was out of sight. Stay here, he said, glancing at Lyra. I'll go in first. See if Jack's around. I'll come with you, Lyra insisted, her eyes steady and unwavering. You need backup. If this is dangerous, I won't just sit by. Eli shook his head. No, it's better if you stay put. Jack doesn't exactly take kindly to surprises, and I'm not sure how he'll react to. Well, you. Let me do the talking. Lyra sighed but didn't argue. Be careful. Eli gave her a brief nod, then opened the door and stepped into the alley, his senses sharp as he scanned the area. The hideout was a place that lived in the shadows, a refuge for people who wanted to disappear. But it wasn't a place for trust or friendship. It was a place where betrayal was as common as the air people breathed. He had learned that lesson the hard way. The door to the building ahead was unmarked, but Eli knew it was the one. He knocked 3 times in quick succession, the sound echoing into the night. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a man with a scar running across his face and a gun strapped to his hip. What do you want? The man asked gruffly, his eyes narrowing as he sized Eli up. I'm looking for Jack, Eli replied, his voice calm but firm. Tell him Eli's here. It's important. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking over Eli's shoulder. He clearly didn't recognize him immediately, but after a moment, he stepped aside. Jack's inside, he muttered. Don't make a scene. Eli stepped into the dimly lit room, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. It was a large open space filled with a mix of chairs, tables, and a few people huddled in corners, their conversations hushed. At the far end of the room, A man sat behind a desk, a cigar dangling from his lips. This was Jack. He looked up as Eli approached, his cold eyes scanning him. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips, though it wasn't a friendly one. "Well, well, well," Jack said, leaning back in his chair. "Eli, long time no see. You've got some nerve showing up here after all these years. What do you want?" "I need your help," Eli said without preamble. "It's urgent." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Help? I'm not in the business of charity, Eli. You know that. What makes you think I'll do anything for you?" "I got something you want," Eli said, his voice low. "Something powerful. Something the Valerie would pay a lot for. And I'm not talking about money." Jack's eyes glinted with interest. "Go on." Eli nodded toward the door. "I've got a friend outside. A princess. The Valerie are after her, and they won't stop until they have her. But she's not like anything you've ever seen. She has powers, real powers. Powers that could change the balance of everything." Jack leaned forward, intrigued. "And why would I care about your princess?" Eli's gaze hardened. "Because if you help us, you'll be on the winning side. The Valerie won't stop until they control the galaxy. But with her on our side, we can stop them. We can take them down." Jack considered this for a long moment, puffing on his cigar. Finally, he exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, his face unreadable. "All right," Jack said, his voice smooth. "I'll help you. But don't think for a second that I'm doing this out of kindness. I've got my own reasons, and if this goes sideways, you'll be on your own. Got it?" Eli nodded, his hand tightening around the strap of his rifle. "Got it." Jack gestured toward the back of the room. "Your princess is welcome here for now. But understand one thing, Eli. This is a dangerous game you're playing. Alliances like this, they don't last long." Eli knew Jack was right. This was a dangerous game, but what choice did they have? With the Valerie breathing down their necks and nowhere else to turn, forming an alliance with someone like Jack was their only option. For better or worse, they were in this together now. The calm before the storm never lasted long, and Eli could feel the tension in the air like a suffocating fog. They were no longer just running for their lives. Now, they were fighting for everything. For freedom, for survival, for the future of the galaxy itself. The Valerie Empire had always been a shadow in the background, something Eli had never thought he would have to confront. But now, here they were, standing at the edge of a cliff, with the whole world, or more accurately, the whole universe, watching. Lyra was at his side, her once soft features hardened with resolve. She wasn't the princess who had stumbled into his life a few days ago. No, now she was a leader, ready to face her people, ready to face the Valerie. She had become the warrior she had always been destined to be. "I still don't like this," Eli said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. The plan they had come up with wasn't perfect. There were too many unknowns, too many things that could go wrong. But it was the only chance they had. "We don't have a choice," Lyra replied, her voice steady, though Eli could see the worry in her eyes. She didn't want to do this, but the Valerie had left them no option. "The Valerie won't stop until they have me. And if they take me, they'll have everything." The two of them were standing at the edge of the hideout, the warehouse where Jack's mercenaries had set up their base of operations. The plan was to lead the Valerie here, into a trap, a final confrontation that they hoped would buy enough time for Lyra to escape. But escape wasn't going to be easy. The Valerie weren't just any enemy. They were a military force with technology and power far beyond what Eli or Lyra could handle alone. "I never thought I'd be standing side by side with a princess in a fight like this," Eli muttered, glancing over at her. Lyra offered him a faint smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "I never thought I'd be fighting my own people. But we have to do this. The galaxy is counting on us." A cold wind swept through the open space as they waited, a feeling of finality hanging in the air. In the distance, the faint hum of engines began to grow louder, and Eli's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't want to rely on weapons. He knew they wouldn't be enough against the full might of the Veleri. But there was no other choice. Jack had promised that his mercenaries would hold the line, but Eli wasn't so sure. Jack was reliable in a pinch, but when it came down to it, Eli knew that no one could be trusted completely in a battle like this. "We have to stay focused," Eli said, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his stomach. "Remember the plan. We lure the Veleri in, and then we hit them hard and fast. The more damage we do up front, the better our chances." Lyra nodded, her hand resting lightly on the hilt of the blade she had taken from Jack. It was a simple weapon, but in Lyra's hands, it felt like it could cut through anything. She had learned how to fight with it quickly, using her natural agility and newfound power to make it an extension of herself. "I'm ready," Lyra said, her voice low but filled with determination. Eli couldn't help but be impressed by her strength. She had come so far from the uncertain, frightened woman he had met all those days ago. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a warrior, and he was proud to fight by her side. The ground rumbled slightly, and the sound of engines grew louder. The Veleri were here. "They're coming," Eli muttered, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Get ready." The first Veleri ship appeared on the horizon, its sleek form cutting through the sky like a blade. It was one of their smaller ships, but even so, it looked like a predator on the hunt. More ships followed, dozens of them, filling the sky with their dark shades. The full force of the Veleri Empire had arrived. "Let's move," Jack said suddenly, his voice low and sharp. He had appeared beside them, his own weapon ready. "Stay close, and don't let anyone get between us and the main control tower. That's our target. If we can take that out, we'll have a fighting chance." Eli glanced at Lyra, who gave him a nod. It was time. As the Veleri ships descended, the first wave of soldiers began to disembark. They were armored from head to toe, their weapons at the ready. Eli's heart raced as they advanced toward their position. This was it. There would be no turning back. Lyra stepped forward, her silver skin shimmering in the dim light. She raised her hand, and a pulse of energy crackled from her fingers. The Veleri soldiers closest to her were thrown back, crashing into the ground with an audible thud. Eli took a deep breath, his fingers tightening on the rifle. The battle had begun. The Veleri soldiers responded quickly, returning fire from their weapons. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, and Eli ducked behind a nearby stack of crates, returning fire as he moved. His heart raced, but he didn't have time to think about the fear. There were lives on the line, and he needed to keep moving. Lyra was at the center of the chaos, her movements fluid and fast as she dodged blasts and retaliated with bursts of energy. The Veleri soldiers were powerful, but they weren't prepared for someone like her. She was like a whirlwind, every movement a perfect strike, every blast of energy precise and deadly. Eli and Jack fought side by side, their coordinated attacks creating openings for Lyra to strike. Eli had never been in a battle quite like this before. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about winning, about stopping the Veleri from tearing everything apart. The battle raged on, but despite their best efforts, the Veleri kept coming. More ships landed, and more soldiers stormed the area. Jack's mercenaries held their ground for a while, but they were outnumbered, and soon the Veleri began to push forward. "We're losing ground," Jack shouted, his voice tense. "We need to take out the control tower now." Lyra, her face set in determination, glanced at the building ahead. She nodded. "I'll get us there." She sprinted forward, her speed almost blinding. Eli followed closely behind, Jack bringing up the rear. The Veleri soldiers tried to stop them, but Lyra's energy blasts sent them flying. They couldn't keep up with her. She was faster, stronger, and more powerful than anything the Veleri had prepared for. As they reached the control tower, Eli could see the entrance guarded by more soldiers. But there was no turning back now. This was their chance to strike at the heart of the Valari forces. They had to take it. Lyra charged ahead, her blade gleaming in the light as she cut through the Valari soldiers with brutal efficiency. Eli and Jack followed close behind, covering her from any angles. The tower was just ahead, and they could see the main control room through the windows, just beyond a few more soldiers. "This is it," Eli shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "We take this, and it's over." Lyra nodded, her face set in fierce concentration. She moved quickly, cutting down anyone who got in her way. And then, finally, they reached the doors. With a mighty swing of her blade, Lyra broke the lock and kicked the door open. Inside, they found the heart of the Valari operation. Computers, communication equipment, and control panels for the whole fleet. "We have to disable it," Eli shouted. He grabbed the nearest panel, smashing it with his rifle. The lights flickered, and the control room went into chaos. Lyra turned to him, her eyes gleaming. "I got this." She raised her hands, sending a wave of energy through the room. Sparks flew as the Valari technology short-circuited. The control tower's power began to fail, and the Valari soldiers outside knew they were losing their grip. Suddenly, the ground shook as a massive explosion rocked the building. The Valari ships above them began to fall from the sky, their engines disabled. The tide of the battle was turning. "We did it," Eli shouted, relief flooding through him. Lyra gave him a tired smile. "It's not over yet, but we've won the first battle." As the Valari forces began to retreat, the team stood together, breathing heavily but victorious. This wasn't the end of the war, but it was the first step in their fight for freedom. They had taken their stand, and they had won.